Thank you very much, Paul. So I'm Bethany Anderson, and I am a science archivist at the University of Illinois. I've been a practicing archivist for a little over 10 years, and before I got into archives, I studied archaeology and anthropology. And I first got interested in archives when I had an entry-level position at the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan, where I worked with early Americana materials, primarily from the late 1800s through the early 1900s. And actually I worked with a lot of papers of abolitionists, Quaker abolitionists who were involved in the anti-slavery movement, and was thinking, that actually Maisie Hoff, who is here as well, just pointed out to me that this is one of the older Friends meeting buildings, and so perhaps some of the folks whose papers I worked with may have met in this very same building, so that's a great coincidence. So turning now to our presentation on second order archival futures, cybernetic dialogues within and beyond the BCL archives. And I wanted to touch on something that Paul said at the beginning, which is that, archives, they're created from materials that document the past, but, what's happening today, is historical, will become part of history. So there's also a future component to this too, because archives are preserved and maintained for future generations so that, folks can look back on what happened and can study it and can interpret it as well. So today we're going to talk about archives and archival materials relating to the history of cybernetics at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And I'm going to go over a few things about archives, what they are, as well as digital records and materials in cybernetics that are held at the University of Illinois. And then Paul's going to talk a bit about his own papers which are held there. And then we'll end by sharing some thoughts on challenges and opportunities for documenting cybernetics and thinking about what that might look like globally. But first of all, we wanted to talk a bit about what archives are, just to establish that as a baseline here. So archival materials and archives as places and institutions are different from libraries, although there is a relationship there and they are related. And some archives can be found within a library or be administratively part of a library system as well, so there's that to consider. But their missions are in many ways quite different, and the work of archivists and librarians is also quite distinct in many ways. So one thing to note is that archival materials are unique and one of a kind. So for example, when we're talking about analog materials, if you were to come across, for example, what Bruno was highlighting in his talk, a letter to or from Heinz von Foerster from Francisco Varela, that might be the only letter that's in existence. However, Varela could have created a copy of a letter, that letter that he sent to von Foerster, or sent it to somebody else. There might be a few other copies in existence, but generally speaking, archival materials are one of a kind and unique, and you won't be able to find them anywhere else in the world. Because of the unique nature of archival materials, so when you visit an archives, the materials that you find in that collection will be the only ones in existence that you come across. But of course, there are some exceptions to this. So, for example, when you come across newspapers or various types of publications for which there might be some more copies in existence. So, for example, the Biological Computer Laboratory, or the BCL publications, which we have at the University of Illinois Archives, there might be some more copies that you could find in other places, but in general, there may not be a ton of those. So when you visit, the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian Institution Archives here in DC, or the University of Illinois Archives, what you're encountering are unique and one-of-a-kind materials. Another way that archives are distinct is that they preserve and provide access to materials. And many, depending upon the extent of their resources and staffing, will have public programming and engagement initiatives that can help engage various communities in those materials and highlight different histories. So the word archives itself has an interesting history. It derives from Greek words that are associated with the notions of government and town hall or public building. So its root meaning is associated with the place of government. So thinking about the authority that had the ability to create and maintain records and kind of execute what was documented in those records, such as laws, various administrative matters and decisions, and while also documenting various transactions. So archives are typically described as, quote, records created or received by a person, family, or organization, and preserved because of their continuing value, and as the, quote, organically created records of continuing value, especially when the organization itself maintains the records. And I should note that archives in these definitions can refer to the actual materials themselves, but archives can also be places that house records. So you might hear the word used in a couple different ways, even beyond what I've described here too. So it's quite a flexible word, I should say. And these definitions are sort of the typical ways that archives are described, but it's important to know that archives can also manifest and be present in a variety of different places where they can be stewarded. So, for example, it's important to recognize that community archives exist, and where a community maintains its own records and preserves them for their own uses. Archives often have lots of different types of materials, and this is not a comprehensive list by any means of the types of things that you might find in an archives. But generally speaking, you'll encounter things like correspondence, both paper-based as well as email, because archives are very cognizant of the fact that email is the documentation of today that's capturing a lot of relationships and interesting things that are happening. So there's a lot of activity in the archival profession to think about how are we preserving email, in addition to other born digital materials. But you also might find things like administrative material, like meeting minutes and agendas, reports, photographs, scrapbooks, which in themselves can contain a variety of materials and ephemera, research notes and notebooks, publications and reprints, audio-visual recordings, journals, diaries, and newspapers, just to name a few. And one thing I want to note is that most times you'll find these materials sort of mixed together, especially in the context of someone's personal papers or research papers. So in the papers of Heinz von Forster, for example, if you were to look at any one folder of material, you would find correspondence mixed together with drafts of publications. There could be newspaper clippings and things like that. So that's another way that archives are unique, is that if you were to view any one collection, the way that that collection is organized is very unique and reflects something about the way the creator either collected materials or created them. Unique to every single archival collection that you encounter. And along those lines, it's important to note that when archivists receive donated materials, we try to keep everything in the order that they came to us in, because that original order reflects something about the intellectual arrangement of the creator who kept those materials. But at the same time, those materials contain important context for each other. If you were to look through, again, a folder of von Forster's papers and see a letter and accompanying a draft of a publication, those two items provide context for each other, so it's really important to keep them together so that that context is not lost. And I should note that these materials can come in different formats, but most of the records that I'm encountering today as an archivist are hybrid, meaning that they both have an analog and paper-based component as well as a digital component, because folks are still creating and using paper archives as far as I can tell, but also, we can't avoid not having a laptop or a computer in our lives. Well, some people do, but most don't and have those. So yeah, the material tends to be in both formats. And so we wanted to highlight briefly born digital and digitized records. So we're surrounded by digital content, which comes also in a variety of formats, such as Word documents, PDFs, social media content, email messages, and so forth. And this content can live in a variety of places, which is really important to think about. So you might have digital content on your laptops. You might have some content in some cloud storage like Google Drive or Dropbox. You also might have content on servers, or you might come across floppy disks that you had at some point where you had stored some files. And I still get a lot of acquisitions of various outdated media. And then you can also transform paper-based materials into digital content by digitizing it. But digitizing material is something that takes oftentimes a lot of resources and sometimes funding, especially to do it at scale and in a sustainable way. And similarly, preserving born digital content requires a lot of resources and technological infrastructure. So there's a lot of thought and a lot of resources that need to go into preserving digital content these days, at least right now, because it's still something that a lot of folks are grappling with how to do well. So we wanted to include an example of some digitized content from the University of Illinois archives, which are the digitized publications of the BCL. which you can access through the QR code on this slide. And I can come back to this slide later on too if you all don't get a chance to check those out. But that's one example of something that's been made accessible that you can check out online. So now turning to the archival materials at the University of Illinois, which we are grouping under the umbrella of the BCL. If anyone wants more historical context on the BCL, I'm sure Paul and I would be happy to provide more. I think many people here are familiar with it, but just in case, we're happy to elaborate. But it was in existence from 1958 through 1976, directed by Heinz von Forster. And in just shy of 20 years, von Forster, his colleagues and students who learned from him and worked with him, developed some really foundational ideas around second-order cybernetics, engaging cybernetics and expanding it really intellectually, socially, and globally in a lot of ways. And as a result, the BCL archives document a multiplicity of voices, ideas, and experiments that happened during this time. And in true second-order form, and thinking about the archiving track for this conference, I've been kind of thinking about what would it mean to be an archivist working with these materials, thinking of myself as an archivist observer, and how I might preserve a record of my own work. And that's something I'm still reflecting on. I don't have a conclusion at this point to share. But without a doubt, I think these materials have really impacted me and how I think about, especially relationships and networks that are documented in these materials. To Bruno's point in his presentation, thinking about that network and how all of these materials are in conversation with each other. And it's one of the challenges of doing archival research is like, how do you surface those connections? And there's different connections that are going to be more valuable or important to different folks, just depending upon your research interests. But that's something that's really ingrained in archival materials, is all these relationships that are around the ways in which they're created and kept. And so that, without a doubt, they're very much in conversation with each other. So we wanted to list some of the main archival collections that we have at Illinois that are associated with the BCL and Heinz von Forster in some way. And this is not a complete list. This is essentially what we have processed and is currently accessible. There's a few more collections that we have in process that we'd like to get made accessible soon. But this includes papers of other faculty and research associates of von Forster, such as Murray Babcock, who worked on the dynamic signal analyzer, which, as I understand it, was sort of like an artificial ear. And so we have documentation of the DSA, especially that was photographed. And so when we got Babcock's papers, it was really exciting to have that component to kind of shed light more on his research behind it. We also recently got the papers of Ricardo Villarribe, who worked on Project CyberSyn before coming to Illinois. And when he got to Illinois, he established the Advanced Digital Systems Lab. We also have the BCL publications, as I mentioned, and records that document the BCL's administration and its activities. And we have the records of various alumni, too. So Jeff Glassman, who is a founding member of the United Mine Workers and is a theater movement artist. We have some of Stuart Umpleby's papers and Paul Schrader's papers as well. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Paul to see if he'd like to share a bit about his own archival legacy and thoughts on that.
And this will be a short interlude. Bethany will be back up in a second. It's a really great surprise and a privilege to be represented in the archives. Who would think? But the University of Illinois Archive doesn't just have the BCL and cybernetics archives. They have a lot of different facets. And one of the major programs at the University of Illinois is something called Student Life and Culture. And I think they established the first Student Life and Culture archive in the United States. So they are paying attention to students. I was a student there. I graduated in 1968. And during my years at the University of Illinois, I was a student activist. I was heavily involved in something at the time called the Educational Reform Movement. And that's through that is when I first met Heinz von Forster. I was part of the free speech movement, which you probably know. I was actively against the Vietnam War and was a draft resistor. Continuing through my years in Champaign-Urbana, I was involved in various counterculture, at the time, activities in the Champaign-Urbana community. And it was through those activities and relationships there that I met Maisie Huff, who's here with us today, who's been my lifelong partner. And thank you, Maisie. In my own papers, variety of things, mostly coming from my student years, but also going forward. I've attended ASC conferences. Actually, the first one I attended was 1970, right here in Washington, D.C., with Heinz present in the time. Stafford Beer presented his paper, The Liberty Machine, at that 1970 conference. I've collected my presentation notes and meeting notes from all the AFC conferences I've had, and they've been very generously accepted to the university. So appreciate it. Bethany's asked me to come and describe that a bit, and that's my contribution as of the moment to the University of Illinois Archives.
Thank you, Paul, for sharing that. So just one more slide here just to kind of sum up a few things, and I'll also offer a couple of just thoughts as well to maybe discuss further during the discussion component. So thinking broadly about cybernetics as a global phenomenon, it's no surprise that the archives of cybernetics are geographically dispersed due to a variety of reasons. And understanding the history of cybernetics and histories of collections can be helpful in understanding the nature of this geographic dispersion as well. But one thing that's really critical to have is an understanding, or at least a knowledge of where these collections are being held, so there can be some conversations around them. And I think Peter might be pulling together a list of those collections, and Paul also aggregated a list too, which will be made, I believe, available tomorrow. So the important thing is that these collections are somewhere that they're safe and accessible. That's the critical thing here. But given the conversations that are evident in one collection alone or in one repository alone, it's important for those who hold these materials to be in conversation with each other and think about how we can perhaps develop some sort of collaborative initiatives around these materials to help raise the visibility of cybernetics history as well as its archives. And as mentioned, there are relationships documented in these materials, and by surfacing those sort of networks, it's especially in a digital sense, that can help to begin collapse the distance that exists between these geographically dispersed materials. Another approach is to digitize these materials to make them more broadly accessible, but that requires funding and resources. It can be done, but requires securing some sort of funding and having an infrastructure in place to make them accessible, and so forth, as does the daily work to simply maintain, preserve, and create access to collections. So we would very much like to hear from you and your ideas about how we can better elevate the archives of cybernetics and make them more accessible. Thank you very much.